Hello and welcome to the Gender Justice in Disaster lead-in session, where we'll be reflecting on disaster, risk and recovery for women, men and children after the 2009 Black Saturday bushfires in Victoria, Australia. My name's Amanda Kelly and I'm the CEO of Women's Health Goulburn North East. We're one of the three partners that have formed the GAD pod. The other partners are, of course, Women's Health in the North and Monash University Disaster Resilience Initiative. So before we actually start today, I'd like to note that we are taking part in today's discussion while on lands that were never ceded by their traditional custodians. And I want to acknowledge the storylines that those custodians have held for tens of thousands of years and the profound disruption that colonisation has brought to those stories. And I want to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging that continue to hold those stories despite this disruption. So for today's discussion, we have two people that I'd like to introduce you to now, Jodie Thornycroft and Daryl Taylor, both of whom are Kinglake community members. They lived through the 2009 catastrophic bushfires, and today we'll be reflecting on their journey since then. So I might throw to you, Jodie. You know, it's been a long journey, and I just wonder if you'd like to maybe talk about some of the things that you saw and some of the things that happened maybe immediately after the bushfires and in that period afterwards.
Okay, so the initial aftermath was horrendous. Really, there's sort of no words, and that took quite some time to get our heads around and work through our properties, and you know, just adjust and adapt was really difficult. Straight after the aftermath, well, that happened in February. By the end of March, we rented a local cafe and started community dining, because we found pretty much straight away there were so many of us, all of our really close friends that were living on the mountain, all of a sudden didn't have homes. Some of us had homes. That it was really important to keep us together and keep communicating with each other, because with the trauma there was a lot of issues with communication at the time. There was lots of mixed messages. I know at Kinglake West they used to have a board up with today's rumour file and the correct rumour, because the communication was really, really difficult at the start. So, and it was really important because of the level of trauma and the level of loss in our community. Everyone wanted to be able to be there for each other. So we opened community dining, leased a local cafe who the business owner owned two businesses in the main street at the time, but lost her home. So she didn't have the capabilities of running both businesses. So we rented that space off her and started community dining, which we opened 5 nights a week, completely run by community volunteers. We had one-off funding payment of $25,000 that we used to buy all our equipment with, and that ran us for 3 years. So yeah, for the first 8 months, we kept this space as community members only. We didn't allow any outsiders come in, because it was like really sacred space, and people felt that they could really talk freely or comfortably around known people, knowing that they would all experience everyone experienced different situations, but I had a familiar understanding with the whole adjusting to the new way of life. So that ran for 5 nights a week, Sunday through to Thursday, and we didn't open Friday or Saturday nights because we wanted to support the local fish and chip shop and the pub at the time. So we thought, well, if everyone brought families up on the weekend, you go to the pub, eat fish and chips on Friday night, but you know, you can come to community dining every other night of the week. With that, we also charged everyone $5 a meal or $10 a family, because everyone in the community really wanted to keep contributing to the community and felt like they didn't want to become dependent. So that project ended up lasting 3 years. I think it's something that is definitely needed in the aftermath of any sort of disaster, because it just kept everyone together. So many conversations happened in that space that would probably have never have happened. Yeah, it was so important.
I think it's really interesting that, and I'd like to hear a bit more about that, that it was community only, because I know, having worked in that sector, having worked in this sector for a while, that there was a lot of people that came into the community to help. And, you know, so obviously from their perspective, they're wanting to say, well, we want to know what you need. What do you need? What do you want? And, you know, talk to us about this. So, yeah, I'm really interested in that, holding it to community. Yeah,
it was a really interesting time. Well, we hadn't had really a disaster like that. So, yes, we were so appreciative of all the help and all the, you know, everyone wanting to help us. But at the same time, we were wanting to help ourselves and our neighbours and our friends. Like in rural communities, we don't have easy access to services or supports. So we're used to being quite creative and quite resilient anyway. So, and then all of a sudden, all these unfamiliar faces were coming into town, and the response from some people was absolutely brilliant by most, but then there were some, you know, responses that you just go, oh my God, what are you doing here? You know, you re-traumatizing people. So that it was interesting, and a lot of staff that did come into the area burnt out very, very quickly. So if you build a relationship with someone, they sort of burnt out and moved on really quickly. They couldn't cope with the level of trauma and grief that was in our community.
Yeah.
So, yeah, from community design, dining's perspective, it was just a sacred space. Yeah. And then it started to invite different agencies into the space when everyone felt comfortable and we knew that they were going to be there for some time.
I think that's one of the things that people, there's a whole bunch of things to talk about from what you just said, but I think a couple of key things is that, you know, people do want to help, which is fantastic. But if you haven't gone through it yourself, understanding what's needed and understanding the trauma that's there is incredible. Yeah.
Look, Amanda, after you can see a lot of communities want to help themselves. Absolutely. Like, you know, what was already organised on this mountain before any, you know, services actually got in here was phenomenal. Instead of coming in and taking over, come in and work with us. You know, work with the, you know, help them bring what they've already got in place to the next level. Like it's a different way of thinking than, you know, the normal response. Work with. I mean, we already had I think it was the 10 days after the fires, we had a cleanup, the whole program designed so the community could do their own cleanup. That would have created mass employment across the mountain. All these guys had registered locals that wanted to be involved in the cleanup. They wanted to clean their mate's house site up the road. They wanted to support them to do that. But the response that came back really clear to the community at the time was like, you're traumatized, go home. You know, you're good for nothing. So that was, I remember watching the announcement of that and going, oh my God, bang, we are going to have such significant mental health issues long term because people weren't empowered to be involved. They were disempowered because they were traumatized. You know,
yeah, and look at, I'd love to hear, Daryl, your thinking on that, because I know that you've really reflected on this over this time and how this works. I think one of my observations is, having moved from a metropolitan area into a regional area, is the absolute capacity and resilience of rural communities and the community connections that are so much both broader and deeper than I experienced in a place in the metro system. So that's my thinking around it. I'd love to hear what you've got to talk about that, Daryl.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what Jodie said so far. In terms of, the community ownership is really critical in the community leadership. And so communities have got to work out how they self-govern. That's an important part of it. Agencies have got to resist the temptation to use diagnostic criteria to marginalise people from participation and turn them into service recipients. So, the mutual self-help and peer support work, the strength of weak ties, the way that leaders emerge. So, it's a really difficult thing to communicate to corporations. It's a really difficult thing to communicate to large service provision organisations, community service organisations, and it's difficult also to communicate to government bureaucracies as well. They're all shaped vertically, so they're power over hierarchies, and they've all got CEOs or directors, and so they know how to make contracts for service delivery. And so we had met within a week to look at the community economy development opportunities. We had about 60 people come to an event upstairs where community dining was held. And we developed a 24-page report around the opportunities and the resources that would enable us to provide leadership in social enterprise and community economy development to do things like cleaning up the properties and recycling materials, concrete, etc., and then also doing collective purchasing. That contract, we delivered that to the Premier, but it got turned into a contract for Grocon, which is a large housing developer. And they ran 12-hour shifts for largely young men from Melbourne. And so, there was only maybe 2 or 3 people from the fire impacted footprint zone, right across Marysville, Flowerdale, Kinglake, etc., that were able to undertake employment. What we really needed was part-time employment and reasonable hours because, we had so much else to deal with, including homelessness and, having to kind of work through all the paperwork and all the structures and all these new players who had arrived, all vertical power over structures, whether they're corporate service providers like Telstra or energy providers or different government departments. I think the really joyful time, if I reflect back, was probably the first maybe 16 weeks. So Rebecca Solnit talks about this in her book, A Paradise Built in Hell, the communities that arise in the aftermath of disaster. And when you don't have a vertical power structure where everybody's working full time in a structured organisation, you have really community in many ways is just that which sits below the surface and it emerges when there's either an opportunity or a challenge. And so we had people who weren't in identified leadership roles step up and do absolutely amazing things in that period. Lucy, who was my partner, at the time we did a presentation at a Communities in Control conference in about May, where we were reflecting on that 16-week period. And there was about 16 self-organising systems that emerged to meet every fundamental human, social and ecological need. And so they were usually just small groups of people. A lot of it was led by women. And so, 1 or 2 key people identified a challenge and then they, developed a team of people around them who could then basically learn their way through. And that learning their way through is really critically important because it's very much adult learning, community development practice. It's not a professional imposition of a service system. And so, one of the most valuable things for me is to be able to work with anybody from outside who comes in doing participatory rapid rural appraisal and getting a real sense of actually what's going on and not looking at how to capture contracts to provide service provision. So there's employment for middle class, inner city, masters and PhD educated, screen gazing, power dwelling professionals. But, you know, how do we actually get employment for local people? And local people could have played this role so much better than the people that came in. Because we're a peri-urban community, no one really knows where the service boundaries are. And because people from Kinglake drive down to the city to work every day, because that's where the economic activity and opportunity is, we drive past community mental health and community health services and GPs and all sorts of other useful services in the aftermath of a disaster. Whereas the rural services are, you know, at Wangaratta, Seymour, Shepparton, Wodonga, they're too far away and they're in a direction that no one ever travels and people are completely unfamiliar with them. We had a series of suicides a couple of years in, and we had suicides at the Golden Valley Base Hospital. So we lost people who were struggling and also profoundly socially isolated, you know, more than 2 hours drive away. Whereas if they were able to access metropolitan services, they would have had people who knew they needed support, their loved ones, etc., able to drop in on a daily basis or as required. So, you know, with the what was it called? The Ring of Steel was just 250 metres from here. So the metro rural boundary is 250 metres south of where we're sitting in Kinglake. And, you know, that was really an impenetrable boundary. And we really needed to, we did loads of lobbying to get service systems. We did loads of advocacy, ultimately to get an outsourced or a local basis for the Mitchell Community Health Service. So we actually had some services based here, but overwhelmingly in those first 16 months and, you know, ongoing, you know, since, you know, most of the really important work as far as I'm concerned has been community led. But the challenge in the aftermath of disasters with all these power over structures is that everything becomes imposed. And even if it's called a community led recovery, there's no authorising environment that enables communities to make any decisions. Communities aren't constituted in law, corporations in law, individuals are constituted in law, government departments have their own legislative frameworks, but communities aren't recognised. So there's no way that they can actually make decisions. And our leadership, you know, we had, I think about 40 people run for a position on the Community Recovery Committee, and we had an election that was supervised by the Australian Electoral Commission. And that was the first time that had ever happened in the aftermath of disaster. And it was
Sorry, can we just hold on one sec? I just missed what you said then, Daryl.
So yeah, the innovation of the election in the aftermath of the disaster meant you brought through citizens into leadership positions, and Murrumbidgee was largely taken out because they were so overwhelmed by the fire. They were probably the least capable local government in Victoria, most impacted by Black Saturday. And so they were kind of here and out for the first 6 months. And based on that, their experience, Christine Nixon recommended that all local governments get taken out. And then they built a brand new structure, which was called VIBA. And it took over a year for them to get their full complement of staff. And then as soon as they got their full complement of staff, they started shedding staff and getting prepared to wind down. And so because they broke all the rules of how emergency management is constituted, no one knew where decisions should lie. So there was profound communication and profound communication issues and profound decision-making uncertainty. So we were just constantly going round and round in circles with no one able to make key decisions when they were required. So, you know, we did some participatory action research around these things. We interviewed 16 community service provider organisations that came into the 5 major local government authorities that were in the Black Saturday footprint area, the fire from Seymour or Kilmore. We also had representatives from 5 local government authorities and also from 15 community recovery committees elected in a similar way to Kinglake. And overwhelmingly, you know, they were, the biggest challenge was the power over structures. So these power structures, that's how emergency management organisations are run, and they're also how state and federal government departments are run. And it's basically just rank and authority all the way everywhere. So people are making decisions that are not informed by community. So we recommended that you have a subsidiarity system and support community governance. One of the challenges in Victoria with the amalgamation of local governments, we really only have regional governance structures now. We don't have place-based governance structures. So yeah, being able to have neighbourhoods with some decision-making autonomy, being able to constitute townships and districts, those kind of things are really important. And they need to be respected as well. It's just too easy for state and federal people to ride roughshod over local decisions, and it's profoundly disempowering.
Yeah, it's a real, you know, as you said, it's a power over structure that doesn't allow for that natural organisation, that community that that Jodie was describing, to actually rise up. And I wanted to just track back to one of the comments that you made, and it ties in with what Jodie was saying as well, that the really horrible situation where there was a lot of mental health issues and there were a number of suicides. And I'm thinking about that work, you know, at the very early on, you've sort of said, well, we've had people come in and say, well, you're traumatized, so you need to go away. I mean, that's, and go away and recover. But how do you recover? You recover by participating in the community. And I'm really interested in your observations, and I'm thinking about this around really the gender stereotypes that are being played out in this structure, and how that impacts the community, and those sorts of things that happened in the community. Do you have something around that, Jodie, that you'd want to comment on?
This is a beautiful metaphor that a friend of mine shared with me, Southeast Asia, and it's when Western white professionals come into their communities, and you know, particularly when there's been military incursions or natural disasters, those kind of things, the people responded and said, they're trying to separate us and treat us like we're boiled eggs, but we're already scrambled eggs. And because we're already scrambled eggs, they've got to work with us as a community, not in a clinical model as individuals. And you know, I think that there's some real wisdom in that metaphor, and something that you know, we had a lot of welfare and a lot of individual service delivery, but yeah, there's a lot you can do around trauma by being together, by co-regulating, by sharing stories, by being involved in things that are about meaning making, and you know, by being able to set in train some dynamics that are more akin to post-traumatic growth rather than post-traumatic trauma.
Yeah, can I just say to Amanda, I've got two really good examples of that. After the fight, I was a peer support coordinator for 2 years, where this organisation got funding and said, we're starting peer support, there's the money, go make it up, go design it. So, which I thought was fantastic. But anyway, I recruited 34 community members. 32 of those community members were clinically diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, right? And they were trained up in all aspects of mental health first aid, suicide intervention, domestic violence, referral pathways, and they were mentored by a counsellor or psychologist that was working in the area as well. So they were all put in teams of 4 or 5, and with their supervising counsellor or psychologist on a fortnightly basis, or earlier if needed. We had these people that were already natural nurturers within our community that already had very large networks as well, that were coming across situations daily, but not knowing how to deal with it, or not knowing what to do or where to go. And at that time, we were being reported on, you know, we've put all these, you know, counsellors in the area, but no one's attending. Well, back then, mental health still wasn't really even spoken about, and it was shone upon. So with having all of these people now in the community with these skill sets, talking to people, I think we've filled every psychologist up within 6 months. You know, talking about how normal this was. Now, at the end of this program, none of those people still had symptoms of post-traumatic stress. They felt responsible, they had a job to do within their community, they learnt so much about post-traumatic stress through their own training, with skills on how to move through instead of being stuck, and they're all thriving to that. Still, like 12 years. The other one I just want to talk about is we had training, which I was another coordinator. I've had a few jobs along the way, where we did forestry management. And we were all broken up into, I think, 5 groups at the time, and each group did a different training module. I had 8 women in my group that were all unemployed at the time, all suffering PTSD. We ran it 3 days a week from like 10 till 2 or 2:30, just, you know, to start to develop, getting everyone to start to develop new routines, getting out the house, feeling good about yourself, learning new skills. That program ran for 3 months. At the end of the 3 months, they were all back in employment. So, you know, community can do it well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, sorry, Daryl, you go.
Other things from that, it was also about taking an approach that was more commensurate with the kind of leadership that women were playing in the community. So a lot of the committees with elections and things like that, you know, I saw it play out. Women were bullied by men in public, and some men were bullied by men in public. You know, there were some people who were very keen to use power over, to have a dominant role in the community, rather than maintain relational dynamics and kind of just approach to democratic power. And the kind of women that were identified through the peer support program, and there were some men as well, were often low profile, high trust. So people who'd been in the community for a long time, they'd often had quite challenging experiences in their life as well. So they knew how to navigate and in some instances avoid service delivery systems. Those natural nurturers and natural networkers and natural researchers, you know, they were really curious and they were really, really good at creating safe space. So their role wasn't just referring to professional service delivery. I would suggest that a lot of the healing that happened was community-based healing that happened through a whole range of programs that were developed by the peer support workers. A couple that I just thought were fantastic were just the simplicity of them is the beauty of them. So one that we did with our mutual friend Maureen, who's now deceased, was just reading the quizzes and the crosswords in the Herald Sun and the Age at 10 o'clock every morning. And it just brought people together informally. Maureen was hilarious. And so, you know, everyone had a great time. It was really fun. And we also had all of the informal connections, and it got people out of their house into the cafe in the main street. And it was just such a rich experience. It's such a simple experience, but it just gave you something that was structured into your day in amongst everything else that you were trying to do that was really quite chaotic. We did another thing, which was just we rotated through a few backyards, some croquet games. So just doing a little thing like coming together over croquet. Community dining, as Jodie discussed, was a really important regular thing that we did that made a huge difference. My former partner Lucy was involved in a book club that was a women's book club. And again, that went for years and years, and it was just, you know, really cemented those relationships. You know, they're friends for life now. And, you know, just even harking back to February 7 this year, particularly the peer support workers, whenever it's the anniversary, we end up at the pub. And, you know, it's just fantastic to connect around the depth and the richness of that experience. And it was trusting and empowering local citizens to provide that leadership, and having the professionals in an institutional role holding the money. Like, we went to the institution and we'd identified some programs in remote areas in Tassie that were working where there were no service providers, and that's what we adapted for this program. And so the institution to hold the money and do the administration and help us with evaluation, etc. And also the professionals as alongside-edness practitioners, as allies, not as kind of, not in a dominant role. So working peer with peer, not tier upon tier. And again, it comes back to that idea of getting beyond benevolent paternalism. So encouraging professionals to not just sit in clinical offices, but to get down on their hands and knees and help clean up the floor or do whatever's necessary. That's the most important thing at the time, in an alongside-edness fashion, and develop respect by doing things with. You know, there's a saying that an Indigenous mob up in Brisbane used that I love, and it's, if you've come to help, go away. But if you've come because your liberation is somehow tied to my liberation, then brother, sister, let us work together. And it's that idea of co-liberation rather than collaboration, because collaboration is what you know, the occupied powers did with the Nazis during the Second World War. And it never happens on an even playing field. There's always a powerful structure that's asking the disempowered to collaborate. So co-liberation is about actually acknowledging the power you bring and leaving the power outside the room and working with people around what their priorities are. Then the community gets momentum behind their own priorities rather than having needs imposed on them from outside that fit with service delivery contracts. And so you can get momentum for holistic interventions rather than things that separate us out. And we found the people that were orientated towards leadership got ignored, and the people that, for whatever reason, were overwhelmed, that was where people went. So there was a pathologization of the community rather than an appreciation of the community. And you know, that's a critical dynamic that needs to be interrupted, because if the pole where all the pathology is where all the resources are, then people see that they can gravitate to that. If you have resources where the leadership is, then people can also see they can gravitate. It becomes an attractor. If it's resourced and supported, the challenge in the aftermath of disaster is that the appreciative inquiry service delivery system is supported, and the appreciative inquiry community leadership is ignored.
Yeah, it's really interesting when you talk about that. I mean, pathologizing, that could be the name of the way that all of our systems work. You know, we try to break things down into components and make them clean and easy to sort. And I'll just fix this bit because I can identify that, and forgetting about the whole. And the whole's really messy. It's really, you know, you have to live there. And I love your idea of co-liberation rather than helping each other. And it's a hard one for us as a community to get our head around. I mean, a broader community, because everything is geared towards those hierarchical structures. And, you know, we have public money, and, you know, we all should know where public money is being spent. That's absolutely right. But the easiest way to manage it is to have an extremely hierarchical structure that, you know, that then feeds up how it works. And we've got to have all of these, you know, it's got to have clear, and we should have impact in the community. I'm not saying that, but we've got to have these, you know, 20 people have to go, and they all have to be underprivileged, and they all have to be this. But as you say, like, by focusing there, we're putting the focus, we're taking the focus away, as you've exactly beautifully said, away from the people who want to lead and can work with and lift everybody up together, because they all know what each other needs. But that's really messy. It's hard to do. Yeah.
I think we're looking at, through the lens of gender, these hierarchical power over systems. If you're looking at a structural feminism, you would design systems very differently than these hierarchical command and control systems. So, you know, we used to talk about compassion and community and courage rather than command and control. And, you know, how do you make those transformational changes? Like, you know, we've seen a lot of royal commissions, we've seen all sorts of, you know, government inquiries, but, you know, in many ways, it's just looks like rearranging deck chairs. You I'm looking at the moment aged care. We're looking at also the disability inquiry. There's been a mental health inquiry in Victoria. But what we kind of seem to find is the dominant player, the hegemonic power, kind of just reasserts itself, and it's kind of like an incremental shift in business as usual, rather than a transformational change. And I think structural feminism really requires us to make transformational change, and we need the advocacy and the courage to let go of some systems that create dependency and let come some systems that create more autonomy. And we've been looking at just what's happened in the aftermath or during COVID. In our street, it's a dead-end street, and we've all been home, and we've collaborated and got to know each other, or we've spoken with one another. We've kind of reflected on what each of our skills are. We've initiated a lot of things at the neighbourhood level that has allowed us to kind of connect and support one another during COVID. And it's just made me think about how these informal systems are invisible to people who come out from the inner city to rural and peri-urban areas. They don't know the strengths that exist in each street, and they don't know the strengths that exist in the community organisations either. And they're constituted very different from metropolitan organisations. I played football in inner city Melbourne after playing in rural Victoria, and the football clubs were completely different to country football clubs where there were men and women, there were netball and football teams, there was no netball team, there were no women in the club. It was a male-only space, and it was violent and vile in many ways. It was very, very different to the respect that was required of you when you were a member of a community. You weren't a member of a community in a big football club in Melbourne. You were isolated from community. You were a community on your own. And so, just when there's no women present, often male behaviour degenerates quite profoundly, is my experience. And so, that contrast was really obvious for me coming to Melbourne. And then I, did some work with emergency management organisations after the fires. And you kind of get these organisations that are epaulette on shoulders, big trucks coming in, driving roughshod over all your local decision-making capacities. They don't get there often until well after the event. And then they've got to find something useful to do. And it's kind of all rank-based, power over structures. Where there's cultures of bastardisation and cultures of misogyny and all of this kind of thing. So, breaking through those, it's great to have more women in roles, but often the women are involved in the community development roles as well as some of the frontline roles, but it's not changing the culture fast enough. And, my reflection of being a minority on a government panel at different times with a whole bunch of professionals is that you probably need more than 60% of the minority in the organisation to shift the culture, because the culture is so ingrained. And this is the sociological manifestation of hypermasculinity or toxic masculinity or hierarchical masculinity. These structures have evolved because of power over dynamics. And so, it makes it really difficult to shift away from the heroic rescue mindset to what is prevention and mitigation in a context of climate change? What really needs to be done when communities are degenerating, when everybody's got big debt in terms of mortgage and they're all, both partners in households are working, all those kind of things. There's not time or resources available to do the local work. And often, because people are seeking higher incomes in rural areas, we did some work up around Myrtleford on a disaster resilient landscapes and communities program that I designed with David Holmgren. So up there, what we found was people were commuting to Wangaratta and Albury-Wodonga, and so they weren't living locally either. They were super commuters like we are on the edge of the city, and so they just didn't have the socio-ecological literacy that you have when you're in place, when you live and work locally rather than become a commuter out to other areas. And so, in many ways, our political economy has trapped us in this bind. We really need to be able to shift away from these extractive and exploitative political economies towards political economies that are more like mutual self-help and peer support. So I would call it a commons-oriented political economy, something where we cope with one another, and particularly when, you know, our systems are degenerating, you know, our ecological systems are degenerating, we're going to be experiencing probably 3 orders of magnitude more fires this century than we did last century, which was 3 orders of magnitude more than the prior century. So, you know, we're moving into this period where, you know, we're going to need to think about how we intervene in landscapes and peri-urban interbased forest areas, you know, just to make it more safe if there's more frequent fires. And that means involving citizens, because every spine we're on the Great Dividing Range, so where every spine comes down, you know, that's a fire flume valley that's beside that. And so that's different here in Ward Street, where I live, to Baldspur Road, which is just 2 kilometres away, or Deviation Road, or any of the other streets in the neighbourhoods that constitute Kinglake. So preparedness, even on the same day of weather, needs to be very different because the topography is different and the threat comes from different quarters and from different reasons. And so that kind of ecological literacy, when this area was predominantly farming, forestry and fisheries, people were involved in work outside. And so, you know, they were actually out in the landscape experiencing humidity, wind, temperature, all those prevailing conditions, and watching what happens to ecosystems and species as conditions change. So they had a literacy that we don't have now as super commuters leaving the area every day, as absent landowners or people who might live in the equivalent of a sleeper suburb, which is what our peri-urban areas are like. And even if we're driving through the forest to work, we've got our windows up and we've got our music on and our air conditioning on. So it's just another one of those screen experiences, but it's a windscreen rather than a computer screen or a mobile phone screen experience. But we're isolated from participation, if that makes sense. And we had a wonderful program up here through Parks Victoria at the end of last century, but that was the state government at the time just cut it all. And it was all about ecological literacy, and they educated primary school kids, and all the local primary school kids did the program. And it was one of the world's best environmental education programs. But it just meant all the adults in the community got taught by their kids what the forest values were and all that kind of stuff. And so we were much more literate just last century with that excellent program than we are now in the absence of that program. So there's a whole lot of things that can be done that can make a lot of difference to preparedness. But if we assume that we're going to be rescued by heroic emergency services men, then we don't do the preparation. And so, you know, in many ways, the emergency management system is an encumbrance to preparedness.
And I think, you know, you've just touched on that heroic-based men coming in and fixing it. And, you know, we saw that in 2009, that this is bigger than any person at all. And so that expectation was always a bit unrealistic, but it's completely, you know, nonsensical now. There is no man that can stand against that. And, you know, that's such a horrible expectation to put on men, and then, you know, then leads to exactly what you were talking about earlier, significant mental health issues for men, and then flow-on effects in the community for women as well, where the rates of family violence increase, you know, and we're not giving men space to go, you know, like, actually, you don't have to fix this. We're a community. We can work together on this. We can prepare together. And, you know, it's a very, these are the discussions we need to have, because we need to be able to unpack these things and work on them together.
Absolutely. Violence, Amanda. So, you know, those CSA guys, particularly Kinglake West and Kinglake here, the state government put it all into the Department of Justice, and people who had been firefighters during Black Saturday were, as far as I can recall, they were banned from actually speaking publicly about their experience. So there was all this top-down command and control, structural violence imposed on these people. And, you know, we've seen a lot of men and women who are involved in those experiences who genuinely saved people's lives and confronted, you know, their biggest fears, and were profoundly traumatised. Then obliterated by the bureaucracy. So, you know, they were muted and so made completely impotent in the aftermath of the disaster. And, you know, a lot of them struggled with, you know, mental health, with drug and alcohol issues, because they're, you know, if you're not allowed, if you're repressed or oppressed, you get depressed, and you need to be able to express. And they have been banned from speaking about their experience meant they couldn't express and they couldn't work through and they couldn't get on, you know, what their experiences were. And, you know, it was the height of cruelty in many ways, but it was all about protecting the government. And, you know, it was about protecting the politicians and the departments and those kind of things, rather than caring for the people that had, you know, basically risked their lives to support and save other people. So, you know, I found that lack of compassion and, you know, that cruelty, you know, and it's the kind of cruelty that men often use when they're in hierarchies and where there's rank-based organisations. You know, you get bastardisation processes that are associated with a new apprentice, or, you know, all those kind of things. And so it's very much about being very, very clear about what your status is from the outset. And it's reinforced often in really violent. I worked with men at one stage who were working in an abattoir. And so they had an induction process when it was being put underneath a cow carcass. And, you know, that was an ultimate humiliation at the beginning of the process. And so, you know, that's often what happens in male-dominated organisations. You know, it's about humiliation, sort of sociopathy or psychopathy kind of stuff that happens in hierarchies of power. And hierarchies of power invite those kind of people in. And we're really, you know, we need landscapes of empathy rather than hierarchies of power. Because if people are turning to one another, then people who have a tendency to want power don't get affordance, they don't get a foothold or a handhold, because people are being true to one another, turning to one another. It's only when you get people turning on one another that these hierarchies of victims start to, you know, the psychopath or the sociopath can pick who's vulnerable and pull them in underneath like a power structure. And, you know, we've got to be able to create these much stronger communities that, you know, where people are relentlessly committed to turning to one another, rather than when we turn on one another, you know, that brings out, you know, all the ancient brain and all the, you know, really devastating things that humans can do. And yeah, it's about, for me at least, engaging the whole brain or the front brain in terms of thinking long term about, you know, not just cutting someone out or excluding them or marginalising or humiliating them, but, you know, how do we create relationships where we can work together in the long term? And so that was a challenge in the aftermath of the disaster, because there were so many players coming in, and a lot of them unfortunately were involved in command and control and divide and conquer and those kind of things. So we started to get the emergence of the horizontal violence of the mutually oppressed. And the next wave of it was even more deeply sad. It was the internal violence of the chronically repressed. So, you know, we had people dying of cancer and having cardiovascular challenges and all sorts of other pathologies. They weren't able to legitimately participate. And yeah, we, you know, the community deteriorated. There was community degeneration. And, you know, is that wouldn't be anywhere near as severe if we were able to have that appreciative attractor where communities were constituted and enabled and supported to lead. That doesn't just require empowerment. It requires disempowerment of people who hold positions of power over. And really no one's been willing to tackle that issue of disempowerment. People of privilege don't want to let go of any of their power. You know, kind of antithetical to all the work that they've done to arrive at their position of authority. And, you know, Machiavelli and others have kind of written about this tension go. But yeah, you know, empowerment work among the disempowered is not enough. We need to work on structural disempowerment as well as we need to work on community empowerment. If that makes sense.
Yeah. Jodie, did you? Yeah.
Yeah, totally agree with everything Daryl just said. The frustration part was after the fires, like especially like with community dining or peer support, they worked so well and they were doing such amazing work. But when we ran out of money, there was no funding.
Yeah.
To keep those projects. So, and both of those, I mean, I know Strathmore still has community dining, but they sort of do it in a different way. It's like once a month, I think it is now, and the community still gets together once a month. You know, if we had the resources to keep that going, it would have minimized so many mental health issues, you know, depression, so much richness would have still been coming out of that.
Yeah.
But you keep relying on everyone to volunteer their time and, you know, giving up exorbitant hours to keep something going. It's unsustainable. You have that employment in that. Yeah.
And that's the undervaluing of the community structure and the network and people's intrinsic. I think that we've, you know, it's become about what we earn and what other people value about us, as opposed to us intrinsically having a value as a human being to contribute within the community.
What we were working on a lot of the time. And informal is just profoundly vulnerable to being rode roughshod over by the formal, you know, the contractors, the service providers. So we had a long tail of service provision, but really no community development resource infrastructure investments. And, you know, one of the other projects that Jodie provided leadership we supported through Can Do was the Bush to Beach. And again, it was, you know, we were seeing women marginalised. It was really like going back to Tony Abbott's 1950s utopia. You know, it was men in positions of power being violent in many, you know, in many ways, socially, emotionally, as well as occasionally physically. But yeah, what women were asked to do was bring a plate. And, you know, they were pushed out of leadership roles where they would have provided profoundly important leadership. And so, you know, we were able to source funding and support Jodie to invite women from across the fire-impacted area to go away for 3 or 4 days.
Yeah. I'll just give you a really funny story, and I don't know, we're going to be extremely politically incorrect here, but this is how it was. First Bush to Beach, it was a girlfriend and I that started the idea at Kinglake first home game match. Started walking around talking to women that we knew in the community. We're going to organise a girls' trip away. Who wants to come? Everyone we spoke to, by the time the footy was finished, we had 40 women that were coming away, didn't care where. We're getting out of here. We're getting away from the kids, the hubby, the whole lot. Anyway, so spoke to Lynn Gunter around there at the time and said, Lynn, you know, is there funding available? You know, there's some girls, we all want to go away. She goes, no worries, write up a proposal. So anyway, I did that, went to Christine Nixon the next day. Christine goes, brilliant idea. Yep, organise it. So we asked another 2 girls to come on board with us to help us organise, coordinate this. Next minute, we've got 450 women across the state of Victoria coming away on the first girls' trip away. So it was a huge success. And everyone's going, oh my God, how did you do it? Well, we live here. We know how we're feeling. We're talking to women. We know what we want. We know what we bloody well need. It was like, get us out of here.
Yeah.
So Bush to Beach.
Yeah.
So after that one, there was a lot of women that missed out on it. So we decided to run another one. That was okay, run another one, organise it. Well, we booked in another retreat and we were told by Zebra, I don't know, state government, girls, we're taking over. We will organise the whole lot. You just sit back and come to the next one and relax. And our noses got out of it. So we did nothing. Went, no, bugger them. you know, they don't want our input, you know, it's our retreat. Well, 2 weeks before the retreat, they rang us and said, can you help us? We've got no bookings. And within 10 days, we had it booked out.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, that is a classic example. Don't come in and take over. It's not going to work. People, we're not like moths to a light. Like we go to each other.
Yeah.
So you talk with, you know, people, you're going, oh, this is, and that retreat was just so important. So important. That really grounded a lot of people, because all these women came through, and through discussions and talking with all different things that we did that weekend, they all went home realizing, wow, I'm not the only person feeling like this.
Yeah.
So I'm not mad, I'm not going mad. I'm actually completely normal with where I am emotionally, mentally, and spiritually right now.
Yeah.
So out of that, that's so.
Look, I could keep going for the next hour, but I'm really aware that we've been speaking for an hour and we agreed that we would finish up now. And I just feel like that's a really beautiful place to finish, because that's a perfect example of how, when we get together and we know what we need, we can solve it. And knowing that we're not alone is a really, really key part of this. So.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So look, I just want to thank you both so much. There's so much rich rich points and things, stories and things to think about in here. And you know, we've talked about from the very personal and local to the really broad structural changes that need to happen. And I think it's been fantastic. Thank you both very much.
Thank you, Amanda.